More Swedes have heard of the name George Floyd than Tommie Lindh. George Floyd was killed in America by a police officer in an act of police brutality. This has caused protests, which have turned into the riots that we have all been made familiar with today. It's absolutely devastating to see what is happening in the United States, and there are a lot of questions being raised about how burning down entire neighborhoods, looting and destroying shops, and starting fights on the streets have anything to do with the initial case. It seems to have been on the edge of boiling over for quite some time in America. Narratives have been and are being pushed so hard by the media, and the tension between political camps are so high that something was bound to happen eventually. Everyone is playing the blame game. Who started what and who is responsible? In Sweden, our media sounds just like the left in America, talking still about the peaceful protests and categorizing news on the very obviously out-of-hand riots as police brutality in America. There's going to be solidarity protests for BLM here. It seems that the biggest one will be exclusively online, and I hope that it stays there. There will be an effort to get the institutionalized racism narrative going here as well, although we have done everything in our power to please everyone but our own nation. It is and never will be enough.
Tusentals människor i centrala Stockholm mot rasism och polisvåld och till stöd för Black Lives Matter-rörelsen. Det började med en demonstration på Sergels torg. Tillståndet gällde för 50 personer, men tusentals samlades och polisen valde att upplösa demonstrationen och alla skingrades då.
Tommie Lindh was murdered in his own apartment by a migrant from Sudan. Some unconfirmed sources say that he was trying to stop a young woman from being raped. The migrant had already been known to the police since 2015 for sexual crimes against a minor. The man not only killed Tommie Lindh that night, but he also raped a young woman twice and assaulted a third person. This news somehow slipped under the radar for the Swedish media, only making it to local news initially. Alternative media instead covered the case that old media did not want to touch, and his name was trending on Twitter by people honoring him and wondering why the news wouldn't report on his death. But the case quickly turned into yet another story of racism. Let me make a disturbing showing of how mainstream media has handled this case. 1. They tried to get away with minimal reporting of the incident, reporting on as little detail as possible. 2. They leave reporting of the case over to alternative media and also allow for far-right extremists like NMR to take control of the narrative, who quickly turned Tommie into a martyr for their cause. 3. They then make the news about far-right extremists holding a vigil for him. 4. They call parents and friends of the victim to ask them about the murder victim's ideological convictions. 5. They then get the parents to speak out against racism, and when they do cover the story, it's now about racism, not a young man dying in his home. This story has now been turned into a narrative of white supremacy. In roughly a week after the incident, articles come out on national media. In Expressen, the story that is covered is about how Nazis have been protesting in his town, and the mom is asked not just to talk about her grievances, but a big part of the story is dedicated to condemning the white nationalists. The headline reads, "Tommie 19 murdered. The mom speaks on Nazi hate." The same can be said of Aftonbladet, where 2 articles are written. The first one condemning how alternative media covered the case, and then the second one is finally, a week after it happened, finally we get a piece from old media about how Tommie Lindh was loved and how he will be missed. But also this one has a big chunk dedicated to condemning far-right extremists. The narrative has, all throughout, been more important than the life that was lost. The biggest critique of alternative media from mainstream media is that they wrote Tommie Lindh died while protecting a young woman from being raped, which prosecutor of the case has somewhat dismissed. In an article from Nyheter Idag, they dive into this and realize that this could be a question of semantics. It is still unclear what happened that night. What is clear is that the same man responsible for killing Tommie Lindh also raped a girl twice during the same hours of the same night in the same apartment. What really baffles me is how important it has become for old media to disprove the idea that Tommie died trying to protect another, although it has no bearing of the case other than how Tommie Lindh was seen to the public. I don't care if 19-year-old Tommie had an ideology different from mine. I don't care if he was a nationalist or if he was Antifa. He was a 19-year-old that hadn't acted on his ideology. His death was gruesome. He hadn't even begun his life. He was still a teenager. I don't understand how media can be more outraged over what group of people held his vigil than they are about a young man losing his life. When Ahmed Obaid lost his life too early as a 16-year-old, the media covered it the very next day. A vigil was held at his school where hundreds of students showed up. Articles were written about how much the teachers would miss him, how his friends grieved for him, and so on. For this case, media had all the time in the world. They would write articles straight away and would keep writing them about this tragedy for some time. They write that he had his whole life ahead of him. When Tommie Lindh died, dry articles were written with little details. Real articles weren't released until a week after it happened, and they are all done with the clear narrative of racism. I don't think that Tommie Lindh's killer had a racial motive just because the color of his skin was different from Tommie's. We have no evidence to prove this, but quote me on this. Had the roles been reversed, media would be sure to write article after article on racism. Media would be sure to say that this was a racist crime, and they would be very interested in this case. A 19-year-old man. A tragedy. At the same time that this is happening, Paolo Roberto, a famous actor, entrepreneur, and TV personality, bought sex from a prostitute. This news had 21 media posts in just 2 of the big newspapers here, and that's just the first day. The narrative there had been that Paolo Roberto was an anti-feminist and therefore a sexist, that the prostitute was a victim, and that the transaction was a paid-for rape. I have known for a long time how important the narrative is to reporters and to mainstream media, but it is chillingly clear in this case. This might be the first video in a series on my channel. Let me know if there's any more media screw-ups that you would like me to cover. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye! I want to say a big thank you to all my patrons. Yup, T. Smith, Mark Schwartzberg, John Patrick, Michael Edelius, Craig Nickerson, Jim Hicks, Daniel Yu, Graham P. Mills, Andreas Bringare, Jocke Hellgren, Captain Erik Larsen, Helmut Biel, Robert C. O'Gara, Chuck Schaefer, Aiden Finn, Oskar Sandström, Sonja Alriksson, Crowley 357, Brennan Bauer, Tobias Schumacher, Ivan Akarius, Gabriel Tieka, ASDF, Are Hågensson, Vyacheslav, Eric Bishop, Tim Bennett, Tony Patak, Liam McCarthy, and Patriarken. Thank you so much.